Hey everyone, welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Beowulf. And this video is going to be a bit different than most of my previous videos, which are heavily scripted, in which I kind of make, a bit more cohesive of an argument about a single text that I read and liked. This video, I'm going to talk about Beowulf in more of a rambly way. There is no script. I'm not going to edit this as much as I usually do to cut out all my ums and my stutters. So I recommend speeding this video up to 1.25 speed or so, and just kind of going along for the ride if you want to. Essentially, the reason why I'm doing this video is because I'm teaching Beowulf. I'm very fortunate to be able to teach. I'm teaching Beowulf this week and next week. So I've prepared 3 full classes worth of Beowulf talk. So I figured it'd be good to kind of come on here and kind of share that information with you. I think Beowulf is a text that a lot of people have a lot of opinions on. A lot of people don't like it because they read it in high school. And I love high school teachers, but a lot of high school teachers don't know Beowulf. They haven't studied Old English. They haven't had the opportunity to study Old English or to study Anglo-Saxon England in an in-depth way. And I think Beowulf is just a fantastic text. I think it's a lot of fun. I think it's very enjoyable if you allow yourself to enjoy it. So what I do in my classes is I don't lecture. So this obviously is going to be kind of more of a lecture because, well, you can't respond to me right now. But in my classes, I set this up as a discussion in which the students kind of lead the discussion. I guide them to the points in the text that I think are most interesting or most important, but I allow them to talk about what they want to talk about. So in this video, I'm going to kind of use my notes for those classes, and I'm going to kind of walk through the text in the way that I would do in a class. And again, sort of the reason why I'm doing this is because college classes are insanely expensive, and I don't think that should prohibit people who want to learn about Beowulf and want to learn about this old stuff to have the opportunity to learn about it if they want to. So I'm trying to kind of share this knowledge because I've, again, been fortunate enough to study Anglo-Saxon or Old English or whatever you want to call it. And I've been fortunate enough to study, the history of the language, the history of the literature, the history of these people. And I've studied Beowulf in depth, in my bachelor's degree, in my master's degree, and now in my PhD degree. I've read Beowulf countless times in the original and every translation that you can think of. And this isn't to say that I'm an expert on Beowulf by any means. Beowulf is one of those texts that there are countless scholars who dedicate their lives to this text. I haven't done that, and I'm not going to do that. I like way too many other texts to only focus on Beowulf. But I have been fortunate enough to get some of the language expertise that is needed to really, I think, approach Beowulf in the most thoughtful and most interesting way that it can be approached, and the way that I think it really should be approached. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to focus on the Heaney translation of Beowulf. This isn't my favorite translation, I'll admit straight up. Probably my favorite translation is the R.M. Louisa translation published by Broadview. It's a bit more close to the Old English. Louisa is an Old English scholar, whereas Seamus Heaney, did study the language, but he's a famous poet. But that's actually why I like teaching the Seamus Heaney version, because while it is quite different, I think, than the original text, it is more poetically beautiful in a lot of ways. It does have its own poetic merit by itself, and I think it's a bit more approachable than a lot of other translations. One of the translations that I want to mention, though, before we start is Maria Devana Headley's translation, which just came out, I think, last year at the end of the summer of 2020, which is really good. And she takes some, to even call this a translation is probably a bit inaccurate. It's much more of an adaptation, but an adaptation in the most interesting ways. And I'll actually bring this up in just a minute when we start talking about Grendel, because I think she does some really interesting things with Grendel in ways, and she does some things that Seamus Heaney, I think, kind of misses the opportunity to do. So we'll come back to this in just a minute. And the last thing I want to mention before we get going is if you're interested in studying the Old English version of it, I mean, you can get the standard edition in Old English is the Kleber edition. I think there's 4 editions out now. I think the 4th edition is the newest one and obviously the most full. This is the text in Old English, with some notes at the bottom. But I would actually recommend if you're just learning Old English or, you're not super familiar with it, this student edition, edited by George Jack. I'm actually not sure how easy it is to get this edition, but it's really good because it kind of comes with a full glossary, or a more or less full glossary. So it's really good to read through on your first read through if you're reading it in Old English. It really makes it quite easy. But okay, let's jump into Beowulf. I like to kind of just jump into it. I like to give my students a little bit of background information on things like alliteration, things like kennings, kind of this diction that we can use to talk about the poem. But I'm going to kind of skip that here because I think we're just going to jump right into the first opening lines, and I'll talk about it a little bit as we move through it, because it's easier that way. But so Beowulf opens, and I'll read this part in the Old English, and the rest of the video I'll mainly focus on the translation, of course, with references to the Old English. But the opening to Beowulf is so famous and so good, and I memorized it. It's very, very good. So the opening reads, What we gardena in Gjerdagum, Theud Kuninga, Thrinje Frunon, Huda Athelingas Elen Fremadon, Offshield Shaving, Shetana Throyatum, Monogum Maigthum, Meiro Settler of Tia, Edsore Ere, Sithen Eres Weth, Fesha Funden, Hedas Fro Frey Jabad, Weox under Wolknum, Weoth Mundum Tha, Earthatim Alquich, Thara Umse Tendra, Over Hron Hrare, Hurren Shoulder, Gomban Gilden. That was good Kuning. So, very famous opening, beginning with the very famous What, which opens up this poem that Seamus Heaney translates as so. It could be translated as shut up, listen. It's basically a call to attention. That's really like in Headley's translation. She translates it as bro, right? When you're about to tell a great story, you begin, bro, you have to listen to this. But really importantly, in these opening lines, we learn quite a bit. And this sets up the poem really effectively. Obviously, it's the opening of the poem. But we begin, right? What we gardena in Gjerdagum, Theud Kuninga, Frimje Frunon, Huda Athelingas Elen Fremadon. We begin talking about these spear danes, these gardena. Gar just means spear, right? That's where the word garlic comes from, because it's a spear-shaped leek. And we're talking about these spear danes in days gone by, in Gjerdagum, right? In Gjer, it's kind of where we get the word like in days of yore, and Dagum is just, Dag, German Tag, right, for day. It's just in the dative plural. And then we're introduced to one of these spear danes, Shield Shaving, who is, we learn, Shetana Throyatum, Monogum Maigthum, Meoro Settler of Tia. And I think Heaney translates as well, he's a scourge of many tribes, a wrecker of mead benches, rampaging among foes. So Shield Shaving is this conqueror. But keep this idea in mind, the fact that he's a wrecker of mead benches, that he is Meoro Settler of Tia, right? Destroyer of Meoro Settler, mead seats, mead benches. Because we're going to meet someone very soon, who, if you've read this poem before, you know exactly what I'm talking about, who also destroys mead benches. So it's really quite interesting that this first hero that we are introduced to, Shield Shaving, is a wrecker of mead benches, and he's a scourge of many tribes, right? And we even see this alliteration that I think is quite nice. On either side of this half line, right? This is kind of how Old English poetry works. It doesn't have an end rhyme, because end rhyming in Germanic languages is actually quite difficult. It's much easier in the Romance languages. But here we have this alliteration, and this is, again, Old English poetry is usually split into 2 half lines. We have the first half line, the second half line, and you have this, they're kind of separated by a caesura, this split. And we have here, basically the rule is you have to alliterate on a front consonant, usually twice in the first half line and once in the second half line. So we have the S sound here, of course, right? Oft shield shaving, shaitana thoriatum, monogum maigdum, meoro setlavtia. So here, obviously the S's, here the M's. But there is this link, right, of shield, shaving to this word that Heaney is translating as scourge, which is quite interesting, again, because one thing that I think this poem does really well is really kind of problematize the boundaries between hero and monster. I think people often read Beowulf as this big, bad, tough guy who goes around killing monsters. But I think this poem actually does a really interesting job of, if we read it the right way, I think we can kind of read it as not sympathizing with the monsters, but showing how a lot of the heroes are, in a way, also kind of monstrous. It seems like the author of this poem is a bit tepid at the idea of some of these heroes. And we'll see this a lot with Beowulf later on, that he seems kind of fascinated by Beowulf, and he seems very interested in Beowulf, but he seems a bit nervous about Beowulf in a way. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But so we get this nice opening, shield shaving conquers all these lands, and these people begin to pay tribute to him. And tribute is a really important idea in this poem, and paying tribute is really important. That's kind of how kingship worked in this day, in this age. And of course, this ends with a pretty famous line that even if you have no Old English, you can absolutely understand. That was good kuning. That was a good king. And this phrase, again, we'll also come back to later in the poem, as other people are called a good kuning that are important. So we get this long opening that isn't about Beowulf at all. And in fact, Beowulf isn't even a Speardane, as we'll find out soon. This whole beginning part is setting up the kind of main king in the poem, whose name is Hrothgar. But really quick, before we get to Hrothgar, who is a descendant of shield shaving, if we go back really quick, I'll try to go through this quickly, but I just really like this whole scene because we get this whole, this whole kind of life of shield shaving, of him being a good king, and then it goes quickly to his funeral, and they get this really nice funeral where they put all these treasures on a boat and kind of send him off into the sea, kind of a, what we kind of colloquially refer to now as a Viking funeral. But it's quite interesting because, it notes that they decked his body no less bountifully with offerings than those first ones did, who cast him away when he was a child and launched him alone over the waves. It's kind of this Moses imagery going on here, that shield shaving as a child was put in like a basket and sent down the waters, sent down the river. And this is kind of how he ends his life as well. But anyways, there's a lot to talk about with shield shaving and this funeral scene, but we'll just kind of move ahead because what we get here is we get one of his descendants, right? We go from shield shaving to his son Beowulf, who isn't our Beowulf. This always confuses my students. This Beowulf Skildinga, that is not our guy. This is the son of Shield, who he then has a son, right? Erogar and Hrothgar, and then it kind of goes on. And so Hrothgar is the descendant of the shield shaving tribe, right? He is one of the Gardena, the Speardanes. And we get this great passage that is just, again, I think just a beautiful passage that we'll really go through quickly, of Hrothgar building Heorot, which is this great hall that becomes very important. We get all this great religious imagery, but most importantly, we get this hall, and it stood there, finished and ready, in full view, the hall of halls. Heorot was the name. He had settled on it, whose utterance was law. Nor did he renege, but doled out rings and torques at the table. The hall towered its gables wide and high, and awaiting a barbarous burning. That doom abided, but in time it would come, the killer instinct unleashed among in-laws, the bloodlust rampant. I mean, that's a bit of foreshadowing, right? There is this tendency of both Old English poetry and Old Norse poetry to really have a kind of fatalistic philosophy behind it, and that we always kind of see alongside creation is destruction. We see this in Old Norse, for instance, in the poem Völuspa, where we learn about the creation of the world, and then we very quickly learn about Ragnarok, right, in the exact same poem. Creation and destruction are kind of the same thing in a way, in that they're always very closely related. But very importantly, we learn here that this hall is awaiting a barbarous burning, the killer instinct unleashed among in-laws, right, among Eithum Suerian, which just kind of means like father-in-law or son-in-law. This is something that we don't necessarily see in this poem. And this isn't really a spoiler. This is something that happens kind of outside of the realm of this poem. What we're going to see very quickly, and again, if you've read this poem, you know, we're going to see this monster come named Grendel. He doesn't burn down the hall. He doesn't burn down Heorot. He attacks it, but he isn't the one who burns this down. So this note right here is about the infighting that's going to take place much later on. But it's worth keeping that in mind as we go through all of these monsters that our heroes, and these should all be kind of scare quotes, are going to face. But at the end of the day, our narrator notes right off the bat that this hall is going to tower, gables wide and high. I like that assonance between those two, right? Wide and high, and awaiting a barbarous burning. That's going to happen from in-laws. So we get this beautiful creation, this very kind of ominous foreshadowing of destruction, and then immediately, then a powerful demon, a prowler through the dark, nursed a hard grievance. We're introduced to this powerful demon, this Ellengeist, right? Tha se Ellengeist. Then the Ellen, powerful Geist, demon, or that's kind of where we get the word ghost from. But importantly, right, the first time we're introduced to Grendel, he's referred to as Ellengeist. We've heard that word before. In the opening lines, when we're talking about the Gardena, we hear Hu tha Ethelingas, Ellen Fremadon. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. So Ellen means, heroic, powerful, something like that. And it's just kind of an interesting connection that is connecting the introduction of Skjold and his descendants with Grendel. So what's Grendel's grievance? Right, we learn that it harrowed him to hear the din of the loud banquet. Every day in the hall, the harp being struck in the clear song of a skilled poet, telling with mastery of men's beginnings, how the Almighty had made the earth, a gleaming plain girdled with waters. In his high splendor he set the sun and the moon to the earth's lamplight, lanterns for men, and filled the broad lap of the world with branches and leaves, and quickened life in every other thing that moved. So the thing that's annoying Grendel is that he has really loud neighbors who are hanging out in their hall every night, and they're all singing songs, right? They're partying. But interestingly, the songs they're singing about are about creation. Again, as we saw with the hall, there's a lot of kind of talk about like capital C creation. And we see it here, that what Grendel's mad about are that they're singing these songs about God and about creation. And this sort of begins a very odd, and I won't get into this too much, but a very odd positionality between the characters in the poem and Christianity. Because Beowulf, the story Beowulf, takes place sometime in the 6th century. We know this because, while Beowulf himself isn't a historical figure, Skjold certainly is, and Hrothgar certainly is, and a lot of the other characters in this poem are historical figures that we can date to the 6th century. So they're certainly not Christian. But in the poem, a lot of them talk as if they are Christian. And it kind of has this interesting quality of, are they noble pagans? Are they Christians? Do they know about God? They kind of seem to know about God in some way. And they'll often invoke his name while at the same time the characters remain pagan. It's a very interesting dichotomy. But so this, Christian imagery, as much as a lot of people want to think that Beowulf is just this, poem from the pagan past, you can't escape the Christian imagery of this poem. And to do so, I think, would just be a complete disservice to to this poem, which is almost certainly written by a monk, a Christian monk. Whether or not it's an older story that was adapted by this Christian monk is another story that people will probably continue to debate for another 200 years, because they've already been doing it for about 200. But very importantly, we get a frame for understanding this Ellengeist, this Grendel figure, who is named right here, in Christian terminologies, again, right? So he is a fiend out of hell, right? A feond on hella, who began to work as evil in this world. Grendel was the name of this grim demon, haunting the marches, marauding around the heath and the desolate fens. He had dwelt for a time in misery among the banished monsters, Cain's clan, whom the Creator had outlawed and condemned as outcasts. For the killing of Abel, the eternal Lord had exalted a price. Cain got no good from committing that murder, because the Almighty made him anathema. And out of this curse of his evil there sprang ogres and elves and evil phantoms, and the giants too, who strove with God time and again until he gave them their reward. So immediately we're introduced to Grendel, and the first thing we learn about him, other than the fact that he is, a fiend out of hell, he's a I love this word, he's a merkstapper, a march stepper. The marches being kind of the boundary areas, right? A march is kind of out there, and he is a march stepper. And we're going to hear that kind of phrase again later, him being a stepper of different areas. And he dwells in these fens, right? In these kind of unlivable places. But most importantly, what we learn here is that he is a kin of Cain. Cain, of course, if you're familiar with Genesis, is the guy who committed the world's first murder, right? He killed his brother Abel. And the narrator here, and narrators, throughout the Midrash and biblical exegesis, often associate monsters and monstrosity with Cain. That from Cain descended all of these monsters, right? His progeny is monstrous. And again, progeny is very important to this poem, right? We began with this long list of kind of names, right? These heroes, or this clan of kings. The progeny of Grendel is also just as important. And we'll come back to what exactly this means, that he bears the mark of Cain, that he is one of Cain's clan. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. But we see all these monsters that sprang from him, right? We get Eontas on Ylva, on Orkneas, Swilche giantas. Right? Eontas, that just means giant, but that's where J.R.R. Tolkien gets his word for Ents. Right? The Ents are just giants. And Ylvas and Orkneas is also where he gets the word orc, which just kind of means like an evil spirit, evil phantom or something like that. But right, so we're introduced to Grendel, and again, immediately put into this Christian framework. And that's something that is really important, and we'll come back to when Grendel and Beowulf clash. But so we get these long descriptions of Grendel attacking Heorot, and they're really, for my money, really well written. He goes into Heorot, and he grabs 30 men, and he just devours them. Like he literally eats some of them and just destroys them all. Keep in mind the fact that he grabbed 30 men. I think that number is actually important. And he keeps going into Heorot and destroying all of this, all of these people and killing these people, and no one can stop him, right? King Hrothgar can't do anything. So Grendel ruled in defiance of right, one against all. Anna with ealum, with in Old English means against. The word for with comes from, is meth, M-E-F. So Anna with ealum, one against all, until the greatest house in the world stood empty, a deserted wallstead, for 12 winters, right? 12 wintratid. So Grendel is king of this house, this big hall that they just built, right? This beautiful, beautiful hall named Heorot, which the name, by the way, just means, that's where we get the word for hart, like H-A-R-T, like the deer. But so Grendel kind of rules this place, right? The Shieldings have to live under just tremendous horror and terror, as there is this reign of terror. Every single night, Grendel comes back and just kills people. And he eats people and does all sorts of kind of heinous things. So Grendel waged his lonely war, inflicting constant cruelties on the people, atrocious hurt. He is Anganga, a one-goer. Ganga just means like goer or walker, right? It's like in the German, Doppelganger just means double walker. But he takes over Heorot. And, of course, he was the Lord's outcast. And actually, really quick, before we move on, I want to quickly look at how Maria Devana Headley introduces Grendel, because I think she does a really interesting job. And she does something that Seamus Heaney doesn't really emphasize. But we note in the Heaney translation and in the Old English that Grendel has this evil progeny, right? This evil heritage of being a descendant of Cain. I think one thing that Headley does really interesting, and when she introduces him, she writes, and pardon my language, Grendel was the name of this woe walker, unlucky, fucked by fate. He'd been living rough for years, ruling the wild, the mere, the fen, and the fastness, his kingdom. His creation was cursed under the line of Cain, the kin killer, and then goes on to retell the story of Cain and Abel. But this is really interesting that here, Grendel's, his free will, his actions are sort of more governed by the fact that he is, fucked by fate. That his creation was cursed, that Grendel is cursed. Therefore, how much can you actually blame him for doing the things that he does? I think that's such an interesting idea to keep in mind while reading Beowulf, because every translation you read of the poem, the translator has a different approach to Grendel. Seamus Heaney, in my opinion, is a bit too pro Beowulf and a bit too anti the monsters, right? And I think there is some slippage going on, and that I think in some ways we're supposed to kind of feel bad for Grendel, right? There's that great book by John Gardner called Grendel, in which he retold this whole story, but from the perspective of Grendel. Just something to keep in mind, just something to think about. I think it's quite interesting. This goes on for a long time, right? We get this long passage of how no one knows what to do, no one knows how to stop Grendel. They pray to all these different gods. And finally, 200 lines in, we're finally introduced to Beowulf. So again, this poem is named Beowulf. It's not named Beowulf in the manuscript. It just starts with Hvatwe Garden and Yerdagum. We call it Beowulf because that's what we like. We like stories about a single person. But this is the first time we hear about Beowulf. And again, he's not named, which is important. When he had heard about Grendel, Heorot's Thane was on home ground over in Geatland. Beowulf is first introduced as Heorot's Thane. He's not introduced as an individual. He's introduced as a relation to this person named Heorot, who is very important and a historical figure. But importantly, we learn that Beowulf isn't from Denmark, right? He isn't in the land of the Speardanes. He is from Geatland, which is over in Sweden, right? It's across the water. The Speardanes are in Denmark, essentially, kind of in Jutland, on like the island of Zealand and stuff like that. But so Beowulf hears about this terror that's happening across the Swan's Road, right? Across the Swanrada. That's one of those kennings, right? We saw one of those again in the opening, where it said, Over Hranrada Huren Shoda. Hranrada just means whale road, right? But here, it goes over the Swan Road. And he hears of this thing. He gathers 14 men, gets on a boat, and sails off to help. They have this great sea journey that I just love. I always love just like the journeys that characters take in medieval poems. I always like the way they're described because I think they're always really well written. They arrive in Denmark, or at least kind of Denmark. The way it's described is kind of weird. That those seafarers sighted land, sunlit cliffs, sheer crags, and looming headlands, the landfall they sought. Doesn't really sound like Denmark to me. Denmark is notoriously flat, but we'll take it. So they arrive in Denmark, and they encounter this Coastguard. It's like literally a Coastguard. He's just a guy watching the coast, who's very bad at his job, because by the time he gets down to interact with them, Beowulf and his men have already landed. They've already have all of this, there was a clash of mail and a thresh of gear. They're already fully armed in the land, which is quite interesting. And we get these series of speeches between this Coastguard character and Beowulf. because this Coastguard, I think fairly, recognizes Beowulf and his men as a threat, right? He immediately runs out, flourishing his spear. What kind of men are you who arrive rigged out for combat in coats of mail, sailing here over the sea lanes in your steep-holed boat? I had been stationed as a lookout on this coast for a long time, and he keeps going on, right? He starts saying, like, never before has a force under arms disembarked so openly, not bothering to ask if the sentries allowed them safe passage, or the clan had consented. Nor have I seen a mightier man-at-arms on this earth than the one standing here. Unless I am mistaken, he is truly noble. Which, of course, he's referring to Beowulf here. I'm assuming Beowulf, stands a head taller than all of his men, and he just sees, Beowulf standing in the back, massive in his armor. But again, very importantly, I think, Beowulf is first interpreted, perhaps misinterpreted, but interpreted as a threat. And we're going to keep that in mind as we go through this whole poem, because I think Hrothgar also indicates some of these same feelings, that Beowulf is in some ways threatening, right? So this guy immediately thinks he's a threat, and he explains, basically, who are you? What are you doing? And Beowulf responds, right? He unlocks his word hoard, which is just one of those great images from Old English poetry. Word hoard onleak. The words thesaurus in English, the Greek word thesaurus, just means like treasure or treasury or kind of storeroom. And the same thing's kind of going on here. I think actually looking at these speeches through the lens of rhetoric is actually very important, because the rhetoric here is very, very dense. And there's kind of a lot going on in between what they're actually saying, right? The things that they're actually saying aren't necessarily represented by the words. There's kind of a lot more going on here. But we won't get too much into that because I'll go on way too long. But importantly, Beowulf introduced himself. We belong by birth to the Geat people and owe allegiance to Lord Heorot. Again, Beowulf doesn't name himself as an individual. He names himself based on his relations. And he goes on, right? He explains that, I've heard that you guys are having this problem where this guy this monster keeps coming in and killing everyone. And he explains, I can show the wise Hrothgar a way to defeat this enemy and find respite. The Coastguard basically just says, yeah, we're desperate. Come on in. I'll guide you to Heorot. And so they go on their way. That's all this great description, I think. And they get to Heorot, and they just kind of hang out outside. They take off some of their armor and they put their weapons aside, and then they're again met by another warrior, right? Another proud warrior, who again questions Beowulf. Where do you come from, carrying these decorated shields and shirts of mail, these high-hinged helmets and javelins? Again, this guy also feels threatened, right? We learn his name later. His name is Wulfgar, which is a cool name. It just means wolf spear, which I always like. But he is, again, threatened. And I think we see, and we'll continue to see this, these levels of security that Beowulf needs to get through before he can actually talk to Hrothgar. This is the second of Hrothgar's men who stopped Beowulf and went, this guy looks threatening. I need to talk to him before I let him in to see my lord. Beowulf responds, and he finally names himself, right? We are retainers from Heorot's band. Beowulf is me nama. Beowulf is my name. Finally names himself. Wulfgar, the guy who is a Wendel chief, again, not a Spear Dane, he's a Wendel, which is, again, is a different tribe. There's a lot of honestly, this term's kind of loaded now, but it's a lot of like multiculturalism going on in this poem. If we keep track of who is ethnically who, we start to see that there's a lot of kind of crossover. There's a lot of kind of coexistence. Perhaps not just coexistence. It's kind of a bit more deeper than that. But we'll see this much later at the very, very end, where one of Beowulf's men isn't ethnically a part of Beowulf's tribe. But we'll get there. Wulfgar agrees to go tell Hrothgar this message that he's here. And he goes and explains it to him, right? People from Geatland or Geatland have put ashore, and explains it to him. Now, listen to this. Hrothgar, who was just talking to Wulfgar, his own man, right? Beowulf and all of his guys are outside. Hrothgar responds, and I just love this response. I used to know him when he was a young boy. His father before him was called Ecgtheow. I think Hrothgar here is doing a couple things. One, he's noting that, yeah, I know this guy. I know Beowulf. But I feel like there's also like this weird kind of patronizing tone to this. You know, when you meet like one of like your parents' friends when you're older, and they immediately go, "Oh, hey, I remember you. I remember you when you were this small." It's kind of like diminutizing in a way, and I think it's kind of funny. I think he's, well, we'll see Hrothgar's politics in just a minute, but I think it's really interesting. And he explains, he knew Ecgtheow, who was Beowulf's father. This man is their son, here to follow up an old friendship. So again, Ecgtheow, Beowulf's father, and Hrothgar used to be friends back in the day. And we'll learn a lot more about their friendship in just a second, because he goes, okay, yeah, let's let them in. Let's see what they got. We'll recompense them with rich treasure if they can defeat Grendel. And so they let them in. And Beowulf comes into the hall. Obviously, they make them lose their weapons first and their armor. And they come in. And Beowulf speaks, right? Again, greetings to Hrothgar. I am Heorot's kinsman. Once again, Beowulf is naming himself in his relationships. And then Beowulf goes on in this very braggadocious way. At least I think it's braggadocious. You might disagree. I find Beowulf to be a bit odd at times, which I'm sure you've picked up on so far, and you'll pick up on more as we go on. But Beowulf goes through all of these battles that he's won, right? They have seen me boltered in the blood of enemies when I battled and bound 5 beasts, raided a troll's nest in the night sea, slaughtered sea brutes. Right? He goes through all of these things that he's done that are all really cool, right? He's killing all these troll beasts, which is pretty sick. And then he comes and explains, now I mean to be a match for Grendel. Settle the outcome in single combat. And so he requests that he be allowed to fight Grendel. And importantly, we get here a note of how Beowulf intends to defeat Grendel. He says, I have heard, moreover, that the monster scorns in his reckless way to use weapons. Therefore, to heighten Heorot's fame and gladden his heart, I hereby renounce sword and the shelter of the broad shield, the heavy war-board. Hand to hand is how it will be, a life and death fight with the fiend. So not only is Beowulf going to fight Grendel, he's going to fight him without a sword and without a shield. He's going to fight him in hand-to-hand combat. He's going to wrestle him. Which, when we see the fight, we'll get into a bit more detail. But this is a bit crazy, right? No one has been able to defeat Grendel for 12 years, and Grendel just keeps killing everyone. Beowulf comes in and says, not only will I defeat him, I'll defeat him in hand-to-hand combat. Why? That's a question we need to ask. Why does Beowulf want to defeat Grendel in hand-to-hand combat? Why doesn't Beowulf, if Beowulf is just here to help Hrothgar, like he says he is, why doesn't he just defeat Grendel in any way that he possibly can? Why handicap himself on purpose? It's a good question, and one we'll definitely come back to in just a bit. And we get this whole speech, and it ends with just this line that I really like. That is, "Gaeth a wer swahio shel, fate goes ever as fate must." There again, there's always this kind of fatalistic tone to these poems in Old English. This very famous line in the poem The Wanderer, "Wer dit vol arad," which I hope you can see there, that I just wrote down, that I always like. It means like fate is kind of inexorable. Fate is fully inexorable. So we get this fatalism. But so, Hrothgar agrees, right? He's like, okay, dude, if you want to fight him in hand-to-hand combat, I guess we'll give it a try. No one else been able to do anything about it. So he agrees, right? They give this long speech saying he'll let Beowulf do the thing. But this speech is actually incredibly important. Again, I think we start to see Hrothgar's politics here. So Beowulf says, I'll do it. And this is how Hrothgar responds. Again, read between the lines here. "Beowulf, my friend, Wina mean Beowulf. You have traveled here to favor us with help, to fight for us. There was a feud one time begun by your father. With his own hands he had killed Heorot, who was a wolfing, so war was looming, and his people, in fear of it, forced him to leave. He came across then over rolling waves to the Southdanes here, the sons of honor. I was then in the first flush of kingship, establishing my sway over the rich strongholds of this heroic land. Hrothgar, my older brother and the better man, also a son of Halfdanes, had died. Finally, I healed the feud by paying. I shipped a treasure trove to the Wolfings, and Ecgtheow acknowledged me with oaths of allegiance. So what is Hrothgar saying here? Why is Hrothgar responding in this way? Well, he's reminding Beowulf, after Beowulf goes through this whole long speech about how he's going to kill this guy, this monster Grendel, Beowulf, you have traveled here to favor us with help, to fight for us. You're serving me, is what he's saying. And then he reminds Beowulf that Ecgtheow, Beowulf's father, one time started this giant feud. And you know who solved that feud? Hrothgar. Hrothgar helped Beowulf's father. So, in a way, Beowulf owes Hrothgar. Beowulf has to pay back Hrothgar for Hrothgar helping his father with this oath, or with this feud. So this is really quite something, that in the midst of this heroic boasting by Beowulf, Hrothgar reminds Beowulf that, no, Beowulf, you owe me anyways, because I helped your father one time. Hrothgar is very aware of what it looks like to be a king in an age where might equals right, most often, in an age where he can't defend his own people, he can't defend himself. This strong young man comes in and offers to help, but Hrothgar is very aware that this doesn't look good, so he's trying to change the kind of framing of this whole issue and saying, oh no, Beowulf's here to help me because he owes me. I helped him with something. It's really quite something, and I think that Hrothgar often doesn't get enough credit for being like a politicking man that he is. He's very aware of all this stuff. And so again, this goes on. They explain, and then he invites them. Right, they have all this drinks. They get drunk. We get this really cool scene, in my opinion, where another of Hrothgar's men challenge Beowulf. Right, this guy named Unferth, whose name, by the way, Firth or Frith, means peace. So Unferth means unpeace. But he immediately challenges Beowulf again. Right, this is now the at least third person, if we're not even counting Hrothgar, to challenge Beowulf. And he challenges Beowulf by saying, aren't you the Beowulf who took on Breca in a swimming match on the open sea, risking the water just to prove that you could win? It was sheer vanity made you venture out on the main deep. And he explains this time that when Beowulf was younger, he challenged this guy named Breca to this swimming match. Beowulf's a great swimmer. We'll see this again and again. And Unferth is basically saying, yeah, that was bold-headed and stupid. You almost died. You almost died just to prove that you could do it, right? It's kind of like a vainglory, a kind of overly prideful moment, an arrogant moment. And Unferth is calling him out for this. And he explains, right, this goes on. And Beowulf responds with just some of like the funniest lines in the whole poem, in my opinion. I don't think they're meant to be funny. I just find them very funny. Where he says, well, friend Unferth, you have had your say about Breca and me, but it was mostly beer that was doing the talking, right? Immediately calling Unferth a drunk. Then Beowulf goes through and corrects the story, saying that, yeah, we were just being children and we were being stupid, but I killed all these cool monsters. Right, he explains that he had like all this armor on. Right, he was wearing chainmail while swimming in the ocean, which I can't imagine is easy, if even possible. But it goes on, right, and he explains this whole thing that he actually won the swimming contest because he killed all these monsters. And then he goes and says, and then he goes and says, now I cannot recall any fight you entered, Unferth, that bears comparison. I don't boast when I say that neither you nor Brecca were ever much celebrated for swordsmanship or for facing danger on the field of battle. You killed your own kith and kin. So for all your cleverness and quick tongue, you will suffer damnation in the depths of hell. Good Lord, Beowulf. I always just find this just such a crazy turn that he's being basically being called, too prideful, too arrogant. And Beowulf just reminds Unferth, hey buddy, you killed your brother. And for that, you're going to rot in hell. It just seems like quite the escalation, in my opinion. But it's a really interesting interaction. Again, another one of these just levels of security that Beowulf needs to get through. And Beowulf, in many ways, is fighting a rhetorical battle against Hrothgar's men in all of these ways. So he's proving himself physically in this fight against Grendel that he's going to do, and we're going to turn to right now. But he's also proving himself rhetorically and politically in all of these encounters with these men who are questioning Beowulf's validity, his intentions, and all this different stuff. No one trusts Beowulf. And for good reason, right? He has the strength of 30 men. He's a massive guy, and their kingdom clearly can't even stop one monster from hurting them. So, Hrothgar's queen, Wealhtheow, comes out and starts giving them drinks. We'll talk about Wealhtheow in the next video because she becomes very, very important, again, in the politics of Heorot in the next part. But she's a really interesting character. Beowulf boasts again, right, about how he's going to do all this cool stuff. He's going to kill all this guy. He's going to kill Beowulf. He's going to kill Grendel. He renounces the use of weapons again. And Hrothgar and all of the Spear Danes leave the hall, right? They entrust the Danes' hall to Beowulf. So Beowulf and his men take up the hall. So again, this great hall that they built that we looked at earlier, Hrothgar now has given it up. Beowulf's in control of the hall, at least for this night. And so they go down and they sleep in the hall, right? They sleep in Heorot. They remove their armor, which seems a bit silly, but again, Beowulf said he would fight Grendel without armor or with a sword. He again renounces the fact that he's going to use weapons. And they lay down to sleep. And then we just get, for my money, just one of the coolest scenes in the whole poem. Again, I think this rivals any like modern horror story. The way Grendel then comes out of the night and attacks Heorot. I think it's like just superbly well written, right? Then out of the night came the shadow stalker, right? The Sheadugenga. Again, there's that. He was a Merkstapa, an Anhangenga, and now he's a Sheadugenga, a shadow goer, which is so cool. Then out of the night came the shadow stalker, stealthy and swift. The hall guards were slack, asleep at their posts, all except one, Ealabutan Anum. This is really important. Everyone's asleep except for Beowulf. Keep that in mind for just another minute. It was widely understood that as long as God disallowed it, the fiend could not bear them to his shadow-born. One man, however, was in fighting mood, awake and on edge, spoiling for action. Again, we're reminded, one man is awake. Everyone's asleep, one man's awake. Obviously, it's Beowulf. But keep in mind that he's awake, because this is a bit odd. We get this just stellar description of Grendel striking, right? He comes in off the moors, down the mistbands, God cursed Grendel, right? Godas eraber. It's kind of a weird translation because it kind of just means Grendel came bearing God's ire, right? He's bearing God's ire. Again, I think the Headley translation in this newer translation does a much more interesting job of kind of depicting Grendel as cursed, as bearing God's anger. And again, we just get this whole thing. It's just so good, right? The iron braced door turned on its hinges when his hand touched it. Then his rage boiled over. He ripped open the mouth of the building, maddening for blood, pacing the length of the patterned floor with his loathsome tread, with a baleful light, flame more than light, flared from his eyes. He sees all these men sleeping, and his glee was demonic, picturing the mayhem. And once more, the third time, we're reminded, mighty and canny, Heorot's kinsman was keenly watching for the first move the monster would make. Nor did the creature keep him waiting. And we get the description of Grendel attacking this one man, right? He grabbed and mauled a man on his bench, bit into his bone lappings, bolted down his blood, and gorged on him in lumps, leaving the body utterly lifeless, eaten up, hand and foot. I mean, the fact that it eats the hand and the foot always kind of creeps me out because, hands and feet are the things that make us human, right? They're the things that kind of really separates us from most animals. So Beowulf, we've been told now 3 times that Beowulf is awake. Grendel just walked in, grabbed a man, and ate him alive. Bit into his bone lappings, right? Bat banlokan. Eats him hand and foot. And Beowulf is watching this whole time. Does that not strike anyone else as kind of weird? That Beowulf just sacrificed one of his men just to kind of get a glimpse for how Grendel fights, to get some sort of tactical advantage? It seems like something that, or it doesn't really seem like something that a king should be doing, like a noble person should be doing. He just sacrificed one of his own men. But anyways, it goes on, right? Beowulf finally, after watching one of his men be eaten alive, he finally attacks. And they grab each other, right? He was bearing in with open claw when the alert heroes come back and arm lock forestalled him utterly. The captain of evil discovered himself in a hand grip harder than anything he had ever encountered in man on the face of the earth. So now they're fighting hand-to-hand combat, and we keep getting these references to Beowulf's hand strength, right? His grip strength. This poet loves hands. There's so much hand imagery going on, right? Grendel eats this guy's hand. They're in this hand grip. They're wrestling. It keeps going, right? Fingers were bursting, right? Fingras burstan. The monster backtracking, the man overpowering, and they're just grappling with each other. Again, with no weapons. They're breaking down the hall, and these two people, I just had a Freudian slip there. These two beings, Beowulf and Grendel, kind of like, I don't know, they kind of like become one, in my opinion, in this scene. They kind of meld together as they're basically just hugging, right? They're like, I don't know, I imagine them like doing like judo or something, or like Greco-Roman wrestling. But they're kind of like becoming one as they're smashing through the hall. They kind of become a singular unit as they just start destroying this hall. Right, and it goes on, right? They start destroying mead benches. Again, which I asked for you to remember that Shilshaving was the wrecker of mead benches, right? So Grendel is a wrecker of mead benches as well. But here Beowulf is also kind of transformed to a wrecker of mead benches in quite an interesting way, in my opinion. The Danes, or not the Danes, the Geats all kind of wake up. Apparently they're still sleeping. And they start helping, right? They start attacking with their swords. But they realize that they kept striking out, but when they joined the struggle, there was something they could not have known at the time, that no blade on earth, no blacksmith's art could ever damage their demon opponent. He had conjured the harm from the cutting edge of every weapon, but his going away out of this world and the days of his life would be agony to him, and his alien spirit would travel far into fiend's keeping. Why can't swords harm Grendel? Well, we're not told of this until right now, and no one in the story knows this. So again, this doesn't really account for why Beowulf decided not to use weapons, because it clearly says they could not have known at the time. But if you've read your Genesis, you've read your Bible, you know that when Cain killed Abel, he was given the mark of Cain, which meant that no other person on earth could harm Cain. So Cain had to wander around like an exile, and he could never be killed by anyone. So Grendel bears this mark of Cain, and he can't be hurt by weapons. So it's almost kind of good luck that Beowulf decided to fight him hand to hand, because they keep grappling, and eventually Heorot's kinsman kept him helplessly locked in a hand grip. As long as either lived, he was hateful to the other. The monster's whole body was in pain. A tremendous wound appeared on his shoulders. Sinews split, and the bone lappings burst. Beowulf was granted the glory of winning. Grendel was driven under the fen banks, fatally hurt to his desolate lair. His days were numbered. So basically, Beowulf rips off Grendel's arm. And Grendel escapes out of Heorot and runs and hides in he goes back home to his mom, essentially. We'll talk about that home next time. But Beowulf rips off his arm and he hangs up the arm in the hall, right? Clear proof of this could be seen in the hand the hero displayed high up near the roof, the whole of Grendel's shoulder and arm, his awesome grasp. Again, there's all this hand and arm imagery. They even hang up Grendel's arm, above the door or something like that in Heorot and display it. So this is the fight scene, right? They grapple and Beowulf rips off his arm and Grendel flees. And Grendel is fatally wounded. And it's pretty clear that he's fatally wounded. And in fact, they even have a bunch of the men, not Beowulf, but a bunch of the other men who go and they follow Grendel. They chase him out and they see him, dive into this mere, into this swamp. And then they come back. But we even see, right, with his death upon him, he had dived deep into his marsh den, drowned out of his life and his heathen soul. Hell claimed him there. There him hell Anfang. Right? There, hell Anfang grabbed or took or claimed him. And these guys, these retainers, right, these thanes of Hrothgar, followed him out there. And then they start coming back. And this is just interesting from like a narratological perspective, that Beowulf just did this thing and we immediately cut to these other men chasing down Grendel. And then we hang out with them for a bit as they start walking back to Heorot, right? We're not really in Heorot anymore. This war band that followed Grendel start to come back. And we immediately get this really interesting passage that, again, a lot of my students often just kind of forget about because it kind of comes out of nowhere and then it just disappears. But we get this moment where, meanwhile, a thane of the king's household, a carrier of tales, a traditional singer deeply schooled in the lore of the past, linked a new theme to a strict meter. The man started to recite with skill, rehearsing Beowulf's triumphs and feats in well-fashioned lines, entwining his words. So we get this shope, right? This skald, essentially, is the same word. Skald is the Old Norse, and shope is the Old English, just like a troubadour almost, who basically begins composing this song about how great Beowulf is, this great feat that he just did. But what he does, this shope, this singer, what he does is he links a new theme to a strict meter, and he good Lord, my cats are going crazy. He links this new theme to this meter, and he connects what Beowulf just did to Grendel with Siemund's exploits. He told what he'd heard repeated in songs about Siemund's exploits, all of those feats and marvels, the struggles and wanderings of Whale's son, things unknown to anyone except to Fitela. And then we get this passage that Seamus Heaney, or the editor, puts in quotes, and this is kind of a song about Siemund. And we learn, right, that after his death, Siemund's glory grew and grew because of his courage when he killed the dragon, the guardian of the horde. Under grave stone he had dared to enter, all by himself to face the worst, without Fitela. But it came to pass that his sword plunged right through those radiant scales and drove into the wall. The dragon died of it. His daring had given him total possession of the treasure hoard, his to dispose of however he liked. So this Siemund that Beowulf is being compared to is actually, in the Old Norse tradition, his name is Sigfrid, or Sigurd, depending which translation you're reading, right? He's usually called Sigurd in Old Norse and Siegfried in the German tradition. But he's the guy in the Saga of the Völsungs who kills the dragon Fafnir, right? He's called Sigurd Fafnirsban, Sigurd, the bane of Fafnir, the dragon. But what's interesting here is that not only is it interesting that we're getting this reference to this other text that we get, in Old Norse in the 14th century, or the 13th century. But specifically with Siemund, who again, his name's Siemund here, For it's unclear if it's because the author just didn't know the name, or if the name in the tradition was different. I think he might also just making a pun, because Siemund in Old English, Sia means victory, and Mund means hand. So this guy's name is literally Victory Hand. This is the guy that this show is connecting to Beowulf, who just defeated Grendel in hand-to-hand combat. I think they might be making a joke. But the reason why I delve so deeply into this digression is because of this one word in Old English, aglaka. What's interesting here, and this is one of the reasons why the Shemitini translation, I think, does a disservice to some of the issues surrounding heroism and monstrosity, is Shemitini just ignores the word. Aglaka means something like awesome one, powerful one, or monster. And in fact, we've seen this word quite a bit in this poem already, every time referring to Grendel. Right? When Grendel and Beowulf were fighting, we got Lixaur Yabad Atol Aglaka, which Shemitini translates as the monster's whole body was in pain. So he translates Aglaka here as monster. And again, we see it earlier, where Fatse Aglaka for his wonhindom wepna ne reketh. I have heard, moreover, that the monster scorns in his reckless way to use weapons. He translates it again here as monster. And then here, in the scene that we're looking at with Siemund, he just translates it as, his, right? He just kind of gets rid of it. A better translation of this would just be like the powerful one, the monster, whatever, had given him total possession of the treasure hoard. But this is really important, and we'll come back to this next time and the time after that, because this single word is always translated in here when it refers to the monsters as monster. But importantly, it also refers to Siemund, and later on, the narrator calls Beowulf Aglaka. So how do we translate this word, which is again used to describe, I think, 5 characters in this poem? Grendel, Siemund, Grendel's mother, the dragon, and Beowulf. Really, really quite interesting. But anyways, just to finish this up, because this has gone on way too long, my God. We get this other digression about a king named Heorot, and this one's much more kind of didactic and moralizing. We don't really need to get into it. And the Danes come back to Heorot, and Hrothgar obviously has this very long speech where he thanks Beowulf profusely, and very importantly says, "So now, Beowulf, I adopt you in my heart as a dear son." So he basically adopts Beowulf as a son in his heart, whatever that means. But this is really important. This is going to be very important for the politics of Heorot in the next part of Beowulf, of the poem. And of course, Beowulf responds, just kind of reliving it, just loving the moment, as he retells the story, not for the last time. He retells this story about his fight with Grendel like 2 more times in the poem. It's kind of funny. And every time he embellishes it in different ways. It's really interesting to look at. But he retells this story, and everyone just enjoys it, right? There was less tampering and big talk then from Unferth the boaster, less of his blather, as the hall thanes eyed the awful proof of the hero's prowess, the splayed hand up under the eaves. Grendel's hand just hanging on the wall above the door. And yeah, I think we'll stop there for now at line 989. This is really kind of the first section of Beowulf. I think this introduces us very effectively to Hrothgar and the Spear Danes, to Heorot, to Beowulf, and this first monster that he fights, who is Grendel. Of course, since we're very interested in feuds in Beowulf, as we've mentioned quite a bit, Beowulf just killed Grendel. And I hope Grendel doesn't have anyone at home who wants to seek to revenge Grendel's death and avenge Grendel's death. But we'll have to wait until next time to find out if Grendel has anyone who wants to take up that tall order and try to get revenge and kill Beowulf or Hrothgar or anyone else. But yeah, so that's the first almost 1,000 lines of Beowulf. Do let me know what you think about this. I mean, this video is way too long. I expected this to be closer to 40 minutes, not an hour. So I apologize profusely for that. God bless you if you stayed through the whole thing. But do let me know if you thought this was helpful, because I could do the rest of Beowulf if this gets like a positive reception. And I could also just do this honestly for the rest of my syllabus, which includes the Middle English poem Sir Gawain the Green Knight, the Middle English poem Sir Orfeo, and then we jump ahead to modern kind of contemporary American literature, where we look at Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, Jesmond Ward's Sing and Buried Sing, and Yuri Herrera's Signs Preceding the End of the World. And I could do something very similar for each of those classes as well. And we spend like 7 classes on Blood Meridian, so I could kind of summarize what we talk about in each of those sections, if that was of interest to you. If this is just horribly boring and no one cares about this, then so be it. But we'll finish up Beowulf at the end of this week and next week as well. But for now, thanks for watching.